In the UK 4-day week pilot, 15% of employees said no amount of money would tempt them back to a standard 5-day schedule. That came out of follow-up survey work around the 2022 to 2023 experiment across 61 organizations in the United Kingdom. When a chunk of working adults looks at cash and still says, "Keep the extra day," you are no longer talking about a soft lifestyle preference. You are looking at a change in how people price time. The pilot was built around a hard trade, not a vague promise. The model most closely associated with it is called 180-100. Workers keep 100% of pay, work 80% of previous hours, and are expected to maintain 100% of productivity. Same salary, shorter week, same output target. If that middle part fails, the whole thing becomes a disguised pay cut for the employer, because you would be paying full price for less work and getting less back. The central question is simple enough to say in one breath. If people worked fewer hours for the same pay, what stopped revenue from sliding? That is the business side of the story. The household budget side comes later, when reduced work time starts cutting the side costs of going to work in the first place. The 2022 British pilot is the biggest reason this debate moved out of theory and into accounting. The program was organized by 4-Day Week Global, with research and reporting tied to autonomy, the University of Cambridge, and Boston College. It covered 61 companies and roughly 2,900 employees. The firms were not all one type either. The mix ranged from financial services and online retail to animation and even a local fish and chip shop, which matters because a result that only works in a narrow slice of tech would tell you much less. And the arrangement itself was looser than people sometimes assume. Participating companies were allowed to design their own version of reduced working time, as long as employees got a meaningful cut in hours and pay stayed at 100%. So this was not one rigid template dropped onto every payroll. It was a common economic rule with different operating methods inside different businesses. The obvious fear was a 20% cut in hours, leading to a visible hole in sales. On the headline revenue number, that did not happen. Across respondent organizations, revenue during the 6-month trial stayed broadly flat, rising by about 1.4% on average when weighted by company size, according to the trial data. For a policy that removes roughly 1 day out of 5 from the work week, flat is already a serious result. A slight rise on top of that is why the trial got attention from people who normally ignore workplace experiments. There is a detail inside that number worth keeping straight. The more specific revenue reporting came from a subset of 23 organizations able to provide detailed data, and the University of Cambridge noted that while average revenue increased by around 1.4%, the overall figure from many firms remained stable. That is a useful phrase, barely changed, because it strips out the fantasy version of the debate. Nobody needs this to be a miracle. The business case only needs one thing first. Fewer hours must not blow a hole in output large enough to wreck the income line. Year-on-year revenue figures make the same point from a different angle. Compared with similar periods in previous years, organizations in the pilot reported revenue increases of about 35% on average during the working time reduction. You have to hear that carefully. It does not mean the 4-day week caused a clean 35% jump by itself. These are real businesses in changing markets, not lab rats in sealed glass. What it does show is that normal expansion did not stop when the week got shorter. Most objections to a shorter week come dressed as common sense. Less time in the office, less output, less money coming in. The pilot did not support that straight-line assumption. This stability, combined with the year-on-year growth mentioned earlier, suggests a resilient model. So the first thing to retire here is the idea that cutting hours automatically means cutting commercial capacity. Then come the costs that sit one line lower than revenue and still hit the wallet of the firm: hiring, replacing, training, covering absences, losing continuity. On that front, the trial numbers were stronger. Staff turnover fell by 57% compared with the same period the previous year. If you run a business, you do not need a lecture on what churn costs. Recruitment fees, manager time, onboarding drag, errors from new staff, knowledge walking out the door. A drop like that is not decoration. It is money that no longer leaks as fast. Sick leave moved in the same direction. The number of sick days taken by employees fell by about 65% over the trial period compared with the previous year. This is one of those figures that sounds soft until you price it. Reduced absences means smoother schedules, better task continuity, and more reliable client service. For service businesses especially, attendance is part of output. Once you put those pieces next to each other, the arithmetic becomes less mysterious. If a company gives back one day, but loses less time to drift, burnout, illness, pointless meetings, and turnover, the lost hours on paper are not the same as lost useful work in practice. That is the whole bet behind 180-100. It does not claim that 4 days contain 5 by magic. It claims that a lot of the old 5-day week was never producing as much as the clock said it was. This shift in efficiency explains why productivity held up well enough that the feared collapse in output did not arrive. One University of Cambridge-linked summary put it plainly through a quote used in coverage of the results. Before the trial, many questioned whether productivity would rise enough to offset the reduction in working time, and that is exactly what researchers said they found. The safest way to state it is this: the administrative and survey data indicate that the shorter week was supported by work redesign strong enough to protect output. That work redesign sounds less glamorous than the headlines, but it is where the money is. Teams eliminated unnecessary meetings, tightened handoffs, and reduced dead time between tasks to accelerate decision-making. Companies in the pilot were not being paid to admire the concept. They had to find a way to remove waste from the week faster than they removed value from the business. You can hear the discipline in the structure itself. Full pay was never the generous extra. Full pay was the test. If workers had simply taken a 20% pay cut for a shorter week, almost any positive reaction would tell you very little. People often lack more free time when they buy it themselves. The real question was whether employers could keep wages intact because the work process got sharper. That is why this is an economic story first. And once pay stays where it was, the household question gets very plain. What expenses stop showing up when one workday disappears each week? The pilot gives solid evidence on the human side around that money question. At the end of the trial, 71% of employees reported lower burnout, 39% said they were less stressed, and 40% reported fewer sleep difficulties. The research also showed that 60% said it was easier to combine paid work with care responsibilities. Employees also reported greater satisfaction with their household finances, their relationships, and the way their time was being managed. Strain has a price, even when it does not arrive as a neat line item. If you sleep better, need less recovery spending, and stop paying for convenience 5 days a week, cash leakage can slow down. The pilot directly measured some of the well-being shift. Start with commuting, because that is usually the cleanest one. Assume a worker normally goes to the office 5 days a week and now goes 4. Assume the round-trip cost of one commute is £8. That could be fuel and parking or fares or some mix, but £8 is only an assumption for the example. 1 day removed each week means £8 saved per week. Multiply by 52 weeks and you get £416 per year. If the commute costs £12 rather than £8, the same arithmetic gives £12 times 52, which is £624 a year. No miracle there. It is simply one paid trip less every week. Time drops out with that trip as well. Commuting time dropped by 27% on average, leading to a lower transport and environmental burden, though that is a side effect rather than the main claim here. The cash value of time is harder to standardize because one person uses the spare hour to rest, another to do school pickup, another to avoid paying somebody else to handle a task. But even before you price time, one less weekly journey is one less weekly cost. Food is just as mechanical. Assume buying or assembling a workday lunch costs £6. Remove one work lunch each week, and the saving is £6 a week. Annualized, that is £312. Raise the assumption to £10 for someone in a pricier city center, and the yearly number becomes £520. You can run the same math with coffee if you want, but lunch already does the job. One skipped office day often means one skipped impulse purchase chain around that day as well, though I would leave that qualitative unless you have your own bank statements in front of you. Childcare is where the numbers get serious, and also where they vary the most. The verified pilot finding is that 60% of employees found it easier to combine paid work with care responsibilities. That tells you the pressure changed. It does not tell you every family saved the same amount, because they plainly did not. So take a narrow scenario. Assume a household pays for 1 day of childcare that becomes unnecessary once a parent is off that day. If that day costs £40, the weekly saving is £40, and the annual saving is £2,080. At £50, it becomes £2,600. At £60, it becomes £3,120. Same method, different local market. Now combine those assumptions carefully. Use the lower commuting example, £8 a week, and the £6 lunch example. That is £14 per week before childcare. Over a year, £14 times 52 is £728. Add one childcare day at £40, and total annual savings become £2,808. Use £50 childcare, and the total rises to £3,328. That range matters because an unverified figure often cited around this topic says a typical parent of 2 could save £3,232 a year on transport, food, and child care. I cannot present that number as a verified result from the pilot materials given here, but you can hear how a total in that neighborhood can arise under ordinary assumptions rather than fantasy arithmetic. There is another budget effect in the pilot that is harder to count, but still worth naming because it was directly reported. Employees said they were more satisfied with their household finances. Satisfaction is not the same as income, and it is not a spreadsheet category. Still, if stress falls, sleep improves, and care logistics ease up, families often stop solving every week with expensive urgency. Fewer rushed purchases, fewer emergency arrangements, fewer days where the only fix is the costly fix. The trial does not quantify that household behavior line by line, so it should stay in the realm of mechanism, not claimed pounds. The workability result points the same way. 55% reported an increase in workability. For employers, that supports the case that output can hold together on fewer hours. For workers, it suggests the shorter week did not merely feel better in a vague sense. People were saying they functioned better. When that happens alongside improved satisfaction with household finances, the story around money gets more interesting than salary alone. The wage packet is the same, but some of the spending wrapped around earning that wage starts to shrink. That helps explain why adoption held after the trial ended. 56 of the 61 companies chose to continue with a 4-day week, and a year later, a follow-up reported that 54 of the 61 were still operating one. What is solid is that continuation was the norm, not the exception, across that participating group. Workers were placing a value on the arrangement that went beyond a standard pay negotiation, suggesting the extra day was being valued partly as relief, partly as usable life, and partly as protection against costs that usually stay hidden because they are scattered across the week. One company case puts a name and a face on that shift without changing the arithmetic. During the UK 4-day week pilot in 2022 and 2023, Tyler Grange, an environmental consultancy in the United Kingdom, gave all staff Fridays off while keeping 100% pay for 80% of previous hours. In a BBC report, Chief Executive Simon Ursell said, "What started as a trial is now a permanent switch. We've seen our happiness go up significantly, and we've seen our fatigue come down through the trial, so we can prove that our team are happier, less tired." This permanent adoption saw the business maintain performance while securing those well-being gains.